When I saw the message on his phone, I felt a chill run down my spine. Darling, your mom changed the password. I can't use her card anymore. I remember that moment as clearly as if it happened yesterday. I was in the kitchen, chopping onions for dinner, the sharp smell making my eyes water, when my son's phone buzzed on the counter. I had no reason to peek, it wasn't mine, but curiosity is a sly little fox, isn't it? One glance at the screen and I could already hear the tension crackling like static in the air. I set the knife down slowly, my hands trembling. My daughter-in-law, Mira, was sitting on the couch scrolling through her phone, her brows knit together. "What is it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm, like everything was normal, though the pit in my stomach was telling me otherwise. She glanced up at me, startled, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Nothing," she said quickly, a hint of irritation in her tone. "Just, your son's card isn't working." The room suddenly felt smaller. The walls seemed to close in with the hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. I tried to mask my rising unease. "Card?" I repeated, casually, but my voice wavered more than I intended. "Yes, the bank card you gave him," she said, tapping her fingers against her phone. "I can't use it. He said you changed the password." I felt my heart skip. My son, Arun, was quiet in the living room, pretending to read a book, but I could see his foot tapping nervously. Myra's frustration was growing like a storm about to break. The way she looked at me, half accusation, half disbelief, made me feel like a stranger in my own home. "Oh," I said, forcing a light laugh that sounded hollow even to my ears. "Well, I just thought it was time to, manage things responsibly." I tried to keep it simple, but I could see the gears turning in her mind. She wasn't convinced. She never was. Later that evening, the air felt thick with unsaid words. Arun went to his room quietly, and Mira stayed on the couch, scrolling through her phone with tight lips and a storm brewing behind her eyes. I tried to return to cooking, but even the sizzle of the onions in the pan felt sharp, almost accusing. Something was off. I could feel it. Life had been simple, predictable even. Arun, my only son, was married to Mira 2 years ago. I had welcomed her with open arms, or at least, I had tried, but there was always this tension lurking under polite smiles and shared dinners. Mira was beautiful, ambitious, and careful with her words, but I sometimes wondered if she really liked me, or if she just tolerated me for Arun's sake. I had tried to ignore it, to be patient, to love her as she was. But the message on his phone had opened a door I didn't know existed. I finished chopping the onions and washed my hands slowly, staring at the faint rings on the sink from previous meals. I could hear Mira laughing quietly at a video on her phone. I didn't move. I couldn't. There was a tightness in my chest, a quiet storm of suspicion and dread. I had to understand, why was she angry about the card? Why did Arun let it happen? And most importantly, what else was hidden beneath the polite surface of our family dinners and weekend visits? That night, I lay awake, listening to the quiet hum of the ceiling fan and the soft murmur of cars outside. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, each more unsettling than the last. I realized, with a sinking feeling, that the life I thought I knew, our little bubble of normalcy, might not be as solid as I believed. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a single, insistent question pulsed like a heartbeat: had I, in some way, pushed them too far, or were they hiding something from me? The next morning, I tried to act normal. I brewed coffee, toasted bread, and even smiled at Arun as he shuffled past me, pretending not to notice the tension lingering like fog in the kitchen. But the message, and Myra's sharp, irritated tone, had unsettled something deep inside me. I couldn't shake the feeling that our little family's foundation had begun to crack, and I had no idea how wide the fissure might grow. The days that followed felt strange. Almost ordinary, on the surface. Arun left for work each morning with his usual quick kiss on my cheek, his brief smile that never quite reached his eyes. Mira stayed home more than usual, claiming deadlines and projects, but I could sense her irritation simmering beneath polite words. It was in the way she set down the dishes with a little too much force, the way her laugh never quite reached her eyes, and the faint scent of expensive perfume that seemed to hover in rooms she had just left. Our mornings used to be simple, comforting. I would make tea, sometimes toast, sometimes parathas if I had the energy. Arun would help himself quietly, reading the paper, occasionally exchanging small talk about the weather or traffic. Mira would sit beside him, sipping her coffee, scrolling through her phone, occasionally glancing at me with a smile that always seemed measured. But now, every small gesture felt weighted. Every glance was a potential clue. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was imagining things, that perhaps the tension was just because of Arun's work stress. Yet the little things piled up, Arun becoming defensive over minor comments, Mira giving curt replies to my questions, and that ever-present hum of annoyance that seemed to linger around her like a shadow. One afternoon, I found myself in the living room, folding laundry, when Myra's phone buzzed. She grabbed it with a sharp movement, eyes narrowing as she read the screen. She muttered something under her breath, and I caught it. "I can't believe this." She didn't notice me there, quietly folding the clothes, but the words hung in the air like smoke. I tried to pretend I hadn't heard. I continued folding, carefully smoothing out each piece, but the knot in my stomach tightened. I felt like an intruder in my own home, watching the currents of a private storm I didn't understand. It was during dinner a few nights later that the first real clue came. Arun's fork paused mid-air as he spoke, glancing nervously between Mira and me. Myra's hand shook slightly as she poured water into her glass, the sharp clink against the glass plate drawing my attention. Something was happening beneath their calm, daily routines, a tension, a hesitation, a secret I couldn't yet name. "Mira, are you okay?" I asked gently, placing a hand on her arm. Her reaction was subtle but telling. She flinched ever so slightly, her eyes darting to Arun as if seeking reassurance or perhaps silently blaming him. "I'm fine," she said quickly, with a tightness in her voice that made my chest ache. "Just tired." I nodded slowly, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. But inside, a little bell was ringing. Something was off, and I had a motherly instinct that refused to be silenced. I couldn't ignore it. I tried to keep calm, to give them space, but every day that passed, the undercurrent of tension grew stronger, like the quiet hum of electricity just before a storm. Later that night, I sat in the kitchen with a cup of lukewarm tea, the steam rising and curling in the dim light. I thought about the message on Arun's phone, Myra's subtle irritations, and the strange defensiveness that seemed to have seeped into our home. I couldn't explain it fully, but I knew something was wrong. And deep down, a small, stubborn voice whispered that the card issue was only the beginning, a small ripple hinting at a much larger wave about to hit. I wanted to confront them, to ask directly what was going on, but fear held me back. Not fear of them, but fear of what I might discover. Sometimes, the truth is heavier than we can bear. I poured another sip of tea, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the faint rustle of curtains in the breeze. I realized that my simple, everyday life had begun to shift under my feet, and there was no going back to the innocence of before. It started small at first. Arun came home later than usual, claiming extra work at the office. Mira began disappearing into her bedroom for long stretches, always with her phone in hand, always avoiding eye contact. The subtle shifts in their routine were easy to dismiss, but my intuition nagged at me relentlessly, whispering that these weren't just harmless changes, they were signals. One Saturday morning, I decided to run a few errands. I was returning from the grocery store when I noticed Myra's car parked unusually far from the house. My chest tightened. It wasn't the first time I had noticed these small, curious inconsistencies, her sudden trips to the gym, grocery store, or coffee shop when I was busy with chores, but this time it hit differently. Something felt deliberate. When I got home, I found Arun sitting on the couch, scrolling through his phone, avoiding my gaze. I poured myself a cup of coffee, trying to steady the unease bubbling inside me. Arun, I began cautiously, did Mira go out? He blinked, too quickly, and a shadow passed across his face. Yeah, she said she needed some fresh air, he muttered, voice tight. Nothing important. I nodded slowly, though my mind was racing. I wanted to press further, to ask why she felt the need to hide her movements, but something told me I needed more than half-truths. I needed proof. Later that evening, as we sat for dinner, the tension in the room was palpable. Mira barely touched her food, her fork moving slowly as if she were rehearsing patience. Arun glanced at me occasionally, like a man trying to navigate a minefield. I tried to engage in conversation, asking about work, the week, her plans, but each answer was clipped, measured, defensive. Then came the moment I couldn't ignore. Myra's phone buzzed again. She reached for it quickly, eyes darting away from mine, and Arun instinctively leaned closer, as though shielding a secret. The words I caught, though fragmented, were enough to make my stomach drop. I can't use your card. What do you mean Mom changed it? I froze mid-bite, the fork trembling in my hand. My heart raced. There it was, the same message I had seen days ago on Arun's phone. And now, hearing the conversation play out in real time, I realized it wasn't just a minor annoyance. There was tension, something hidden beneath the polite facade, and it involved money. Arun, can we talk? I asked quietly, the words heavy with a calm that masked my racing thoughts. Myra's hand froze mid-air, her eyes snapping toward me. Arun's face paled slightly, a bead of sweat forming at his temple. About what, Mom, he said, a little too casually. I didn't answer immediately. I just watched, quietly, as the silence stretched and the faint tick of the kitchen clock seemed impossibly loud. Myra's fingers drummed against the table, her lips pressed together, her gaze darting nervously between Arun and me. Finally, I spoke, voice soft but firm. I saw the message on your phone. About the card. Why did you act like you couldn't use it? What is really going on? Arun shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. Myra's hand clenched slightly, her knuckles white. The air between us was thick with unspoken words, and for the first time, I realized how little I truly knew about my son's marriage. The life I had imagined, warm dinners, quiet weekends, family closeness, was starting to look like a carefully maintained illusion. And in that moment, I felt it, the first real pang of betrayal, the unsettling awareness that something significant was being hidden from me. I couldn't pinpoint it yet, but I knew, with a certainty that made my chest ache, that the storm I had sensed was gathering, ready to break. That night, I sat in my room, listening to the faint hum of the ceiling fan. The house was quiet, but the tension lingered, heavy like smoke. I realized I couldn't ignore this anymore. I needed answers, no matter how painful they might be. Something was happening beneath the surface of my family, and I had no choice but to uncover it. The next morning, I woke up with a quiet resolve. I couldn't sit by and watch the tension simmer without understanding what had caused it. Arun left for work as usual, barely meeting my eyes, and Mira lingered in the kitchen longer than necessary, her movements careful, deliberate. The smell of brewing coffee mingled with the faint aroma of toast, but I barely noticed it. My mind was already spinning through the possibilities, what secret lay behind that locked card, the frustrated messages, the subtle defensiveness. I decided to wait. I had learned over the years that confrontation without preparation often backfires. So I observed. I watched the way Mira moved through the house, the way her eyes darted toward Arun whenever he came near. I noticed how Arun's phone was never far from his grasp, how he typed quickly whenever she passed by, always careful, always alert. By mid-afternoon, my patience cracked just enough. Mira had stepped out to run an errand, leaving her bag carelessly on the dining table. My hands shook as I picked it up, hesitating for just a heartbeat before opening it. Inside, neatly tucked under a few receipts and a pair of sunglasses, was a small notebook. I flipped it open. The handwriting was familiar, Myra's, precise and careful, but the contents made my blood run cold. Lists of expenditures, notes on what she had bought using Arun's card, and, buried in the middle, references to Mom's account and new password. My hands trembled as I read the details, every transaction she had made, every attempt to access the account, and the frustrated notes whenever the card didn't work. I heard the front door click, and my heart skipped. Mira was back. I quickly closed the notebook and set it on the table, as if I had been doing nothing at all. "Hey," she said casually, but her tone carried a subtle edge, as if she knew I had been prying. She hung up her coat and moved toward the kitchen, her eyes briefly meeting mine. There was a flicker there, surprise, maybe guilt, but masked quickly behind a practiced smile. "Hey," I replied softly, my voice calm despite the storm raging inside me. Dinner was tense that evening. Arun was quieter than usual, and Myra's responses were clipped. I kept my questions neutral, my tone measured, but my mind was sharp, reading every glance, every hesitation, every subtle movement. After the plates were cleared, I finally spoke, my voice low and steady. "Mira, Arun, we need to talk about the card. About the money." Arun froze mid-step, and Myra's hand trembled slightly as she placed a glass on the table. "Mom, it's nothing," Arun said quickly, but his voice lacked conviction. "It's not nothing," I said, taking a deep breath. "I saw the messages, and I found the notebook." I didn't accuse, didn't shout. I just stated it, calmly, firmly. "I know you've been trying to use the card without permission. Why? Why lie about it?" Myra's eyes welled up, and I could see the frustration, the fear, and, yes, guilt mingling there. "It wasn't like that," she said, voice quivering. I thought you'd be upset if I asked for money. I didn't mean to hide anything. I just needed it for bills, and Arun said it was fine." Arun's face darkened. "Mom, she didn't mean to," his voice faltered under the weight of my gaze. I could feel my own heart aching, a mix of relief, hurt, and disbelief. Relief that it wasn't something catastrophic, hurt that they had felt the need to deceive me, disbelief that the trust one had assumed existed had been broken so quietly. "I understand needing help," I said finally, my tone softening slightly. "But secrecy? Lying? That's not how we do things. We are family. We talk. We ask. Not hide." There was silence after that. The kind of heavy, thick silence that fills a room when truths are laid bare, when the air itself seems to be holding its breath. I realized then that the breach wasn't just about money, it was about trust. About honesty. About knowing that even the smallest lie can fracture relationships that have been built over years. I spent the next few days in quiet reflection. I didn't scold or lecture, I let the weight of the discovery settle over the household like a soft, but unyielding, fog. Arun and Mira were careful around me, their voices measured, their gestures polite but restrained. I wanted to act, to reclaim the authority I felt had been undermined, but I also knew that anger would only widen the rift. I needed strategy, calm, deliberate, and quietly effective. It started with small, subtle changes. I adjusted the account details, changed passwords not in secrecy but in a way that forced them to ask me directly for access. I watched their reactions. Arun's hesitation was subtle, a half-step back when I casually mentioned the update, while Myra's eyes flickered briefly with frustration, controlled, but visible. One evening, I called Arun into the living room while Mira was in the kitchen. My voice was calm, almost conversational, as if discussing the weather rather than finances. "Arun," I said softly, "I noticed some withdrawals from the account. Care to explain?" He swallowed hard, shifting uncomfortably on the sofa. "Mom, we needed it. I didn't want to upset you." I nodded slowly. "I understand needing help. But secrecy, lying, that's not acceptable. If you need something, you ask. You don't hide." He looked down, a faint tremor in his jaw. "I know. I messed up." I waited, letting the words settle. silence, as heavy as fog, filled the room. Finally, I added, I want to help you, but only if we can rebuild trust. No more hiding. No more pretending. We can work this out together. Arun nodded, a shadow of relief crossing his face. The tension in his shoulders eased, though I could tell he was still wary. Later, I spoke to Mira alone. She was folding laundry in the bedroom, her movements slow, deliberate. I leaned against the doorframe, not intruding, just present. Mira, I said quietly, I found the notebook. Her hand stilled, the fabric slipping through her fingers. I know you did. I'm sorry, she whispered, eyes downcast. I didn't mean to hurt you. I panicked. I walked over slowly, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. I understand fear, I said softly. But fear should never replace honesty. We are a family. We should share our burdens, not hide them. Her shoulders shook slightly, a quiet sigh escaping her lips. I promise, no more secrets. I nodded, feeling a small sense of victory, not over her, not over Arun, but over the tension that had quietly crept into our lives. I wasn't seeking revenge or punishment. I wanted honesty. I wanted respect. And slowly, I could see the first fragile threads of that beginning to return. The following week, I noticed a subtle shift in their behavior. Arun consulted me before making any purchases, and Myra's laughter, still measured but genuine, returned to the evenings. Dinner conversations resumed, small and cautious at first, but slowly warmer. I made a point to include them in discussions about finances, showing that trust wasn't just about withholding information, it was about guidance and support. There was a lesson in all of this, I realized. Trust is fragile. It is not built on fear or avoidance, but on openness, dialogue, and patience. The moment we allow deception, even in small ways, to creep in, the foundation begins to crack. But equally, patience, calm, and a measured response can repair it, often in ways that anger and punishment cannot. By the end of that week, the house felt lighter. The smell of freshly brewed coffee, the sound of laughter in the kitchen, and the subtle clink of cutlery on plates all felt different, warmer, safer, more real. And while the memory of those tense messages would linger, the lesson they brought with them had firmly taken root. It wasn't long before the ripple effects of our little confrontation reached beyond our home. Arun's colleagues began noticing subtle changes in him. He was more focused, less anxious, and oddly more transparent about his schedule and work-related expenses. Mira, too, seemed lighter, though still cautious, when she went out for errands or met friends. I had hoped this would be a private matter, but human nature has a way of letting the truth slip into the world. The first sign came when Arun's best friend, Ramesh, came over one evening for tea. He glanced at the kitchen counter where I kept the family calendar and financial notes. His eyebrows rose in mild surprise. Arun told me about the card thing, he said casually, as if discussing the weather. I felt a flicker of embarrassment, but also relief. The truth was out, and the tension was finally lifting its heavy hand. Yes, I said, pouring tea, my voice calm and unflustered. There was a misunderstanding, and we cleared it. Ramesh nodded, sipping his tea. I think it's good. Sometimes people hide things thinking it helps, but it just makes it worse. Arun seemed stressed, but he's better now. That evening, I realized something. By handling the situation calmly, by addressing the deception without anger, we had created a model of accountability not just for our household, but for the wider circle of friends and family. Word spread quietly, almost imperceptibly, about how we had confronted the issue with dignity and fairness. And slowly, those who had once sympathized silently with Myra's frustrations began seeing the full picture, not of rebellion or wrongdoing, but of trust being restored. One Sunday, my sister called. She had overheard Myra's mother-in-law talking about the card incident and wanted to check in. Instead of feeling defensive, I shared the truth plainly. We had discovered the secret use of the card, confronted it calmly, and used it as an opportunity to rebuild trust. My sister's response was immediate and warm admiration, not gossip. "You handled that with grace," she said. "So many people would have erupted, but you taught a lesson." It struck me then that the real consequence was not punishment, but exposure of the truth. The public nature of the revelation didn't humiliate anyone, it encouraged reflection. Arun and Mira had faced the quiet moral weight of their actions, and in doing so, they had corrected their course. The outside world simply witnessed what was already happening within the walls of our home. At the neighborhood potluck a week later, I noticed subtle changes in social dynamics. Friends who had been quiet about family finances now openly discussed budgeting and communication. The story of the card became a gentle lesson, not a scandal. And in all of it, Myra's attitude had shifted. She laughed more freely, held her head high, and occasionally reached across the table to squeeze my hand with genuine affection. Arun's gratitude was quiet but unmistakable. I realized that the consequence of truth wasn't just about accountability, it was about restoring the moral balance that secrecy threatens. People who hide things, even out of fear or pride, carry invisible weights. When those weights are acknowledged and addressed with integrity, the relief is palpable, almost transformative. By the end of that week, I could see that our family had changed, not because punishment had been served, but because honesty had been restored. Trust, once fractured, had begun to mend. And the public consequences, the whispers, the curious glances, the small conversations, only reinforced what we had done privately, confronted deception, faced it calmly, and chose integrity over fear. In the quiet that followed the storm, our home began to breathe again. Mornings were calm, the smell of coffee and toast once again mingling with soft laughter. Arun no longer shuffled past me with half-hearted smiles, instead, he lingered, sometimes sharing small details of his day, seeking my advice or opinion. Mira, too, carried herself differently, lighter and more open. There was a subtle warmth in the air, one that hadn't been there for weeks. I made a conscious effort to nurture this fragile healing. We started small, shared meals without distractions, casual conversations that went beyond work or errands, and even a weekend walk in the park, just the three of us. These moments, though ordinary, felt monumental. They reminded me that relationships are built in the quiet gestures, the shared laughter, and the willingness to forgive and rebuild. One evening, as I was washing dishes, Mira appeared behind me, her hands resting briefly on my shoulders. "Thank you," she whispered softly. "For handling everything the way you did. For not overreacting." I smiled faintly, the warm glow of the kitchen light reflecting off the dishes. "Sometimes, love means patience," I said. "Sometimes, it's letting people make mistakes and then showing them the right way to move forward." Her eyes glistened, and I could see the relief in her posture. That tiny moment, simple, intimate, unspoken, told me more than words ever could. Our family was healing, slowly, steadily, with understanding at its core. I reflected on the lessons this ordeal had taught me. Trust, I realized, is not a static thing. It must be nurtured daily, defended gently, and, when broken, mended with care and honesty. It is fragile, yes, but resilient when handled with patience. And even when mistakes happen, whether from fear, pride, or simple human error, there is always room to restore what has been lost, if only we approach it with integrity and calm. By the third week after the revelation, Arun and Mira had developed a new rhythm. Financial matters were discussed openly, each purchase, each decision was transparent, shared, and agreed upon. The card incident, once a source of tension and secrecy, had become a reference point for growth, a silent reminder of what happens when communication fails, and how much stronger bonds can become when honesty prevails. I watched them interact, sometimes laughing over shared jokes, other times quietly discussing plans. The weight of secrecy had lifted from their shoulders, and the lightness in their demeanor was almost tangible. I realized that my role as a mother wasn't just to provide or protect, it was to guide, to model integrity, and to create a space where honesty was not feared but welcomed. That night, after tucking Arun into bed, I found Mira in the kitchen again, quietly cleaning up. I poured myself a cup of tea and joined her, leaning against the counter. She handed me a small plate of biscuits, and I could see the genuine warmth in her smile. "Life feels lighter now," she said softly. "I see how much I overcomplicated things, how unnecessary the secrets were. Thank you for showing me another way." I nodded, stirring my tea slowly, savoring the warmth. "We all make mistakes," I said gently. "But what matters is what we do after. How we learn, how we rebuild, and how we choose honesty over fear." In that quiet kitchen, with the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant murmur of the night outside, I felt a profound sense of closure. Not because the past was erased, but because we had faced it together, learned from it, and emerged stronger. Our family, fragile though it sometimes was, had begun to heal. And as I sipped my tea, I realized something important. The real victory wasn't in controlling or punishing, it was in patience, understanding, and the quiet courage to uphold truth and trust, even when it feels impossible. As I sit here now, in the quiet of the evening, I think back to that first message on Arun's phone. "Darling, your mom changed the password. I can't use her card anymore." At the time, it felt like the beginning of a storm, a signal that something in our family was fraying. But in truth, it was the first step toward understanding, toward honesty, and toward rebuilding what we almost lost. I've learned that family isn't just about proximity or shared meals. It's about trust, communication, and the courage to face mistakes without letting pride or fear dictate our actions. When we react with patience instead of anger, when we guide rather than punish, we give others the chance to grow, and sometimes, that is the most powerful form of love there is. Mira and Arun have changed. Not because I demanded it, or because of shame, but because they saw the consequences of secrecy and the quiet strength of integrity. Our dinners are warm again, our laughter genuine. And though the memory of that tension lingers faintly, it serves as a reminder: honesty is a choice, and trust is something we rebuild every single day. I wonder, as I finish this reflection, how many of us hold back truths from those we love, fearing judgment or conflict. How many small lies slowly build walls between hearts, unnoticed until they crack. I hope that if you find yourself in a similar situation, you can remember that calm, patience, and openness often do more to heal than anger or resentment ever could. Family is messy, fragile, and complicated, but it is also resilient when treated with love and respect. And sometimes, the smallest actions, the choice to speak honestly, to forgive, to guide rather than scold, can change the course of relationships in ways we never imagined. So I leave you with this question: have you been hiding truths from someone you love? And if so, what might happen if you faced them gently, with honesty and patience? Our lives are filled with these small, powerful choices every day. Choosing truth, choosing trust, choosing love, these are the moments that define us. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you of your own family struggles or triumphs, I hope you'll share it, reflect on it, and carry its lesson forward. And if you want to hear more stories that explore the quiet, complicated power of family, love, and trust, don't forget to subscribe. Because sometimes, the hardest stories to tell are the ones that change us the most.